Have you ever wondered what it takes to break an empire built on human suffering? What happens when one person, stripped of everything, decides that silence is no longer an option? Tonight, I'm going to tell you something that few people know. A story that powerful men tried to bury in the burning sands of the Sahara for almost 2 centuries. This isn't just another tale of survival. This is the account of a man who was supposed to disappear, like thousands before him, swallowed by the desert, forgotten by history. But Kofi didn't disappear. In 1845, in the scorching heart of Sudan, a young man of 23 years held a secret so dangerous that entire merchant dynasties would have paid fortunes to see him dead. The Zibar traders, those elegant men who controlled the caravan routes from Darfur to Egypt, had built their wealth on a foundation of bones and silence. They moved gold, ivory, and something far more profitable, human beings. Thousands of them, year after year. And they had perfected a system so efficient, so invisible to the outside world, that European abolitionists believed the trans-Saharan slave trade was merely a relic of ancient times. They were wrong. If you want to understand how one man exposed one of the greatest criminal networks of the 19th century, stay with me until the end. I promise you, what Kofi witnessed, what he survived, and what he ultimately revealed will change everything you thought you knew about the hidden corridors of history. Hit that subscribe button right now, because stories like this one, stories that powerful people wanted erased, deserve to be told. And I need you here with me to make sure they're never forgotten again. What Kofi carried in his memory was worth more than gold, and far more dangerous. The ruins still exist today. If you travel to the forgotten edge of the Darfur Plateau, where the desert meets the savannah in a trembling line of heat and dust, you will find them. Crumbling walls of mud brick, half swallowed by sand dunes that shift with each passing season. The local people avoid these places. They say the wind carries voices at night, whispers in languages no one speaks anymore. The elders know what happened here. They remember the names. They remember the screams. In 1845, this was not a ruin. This was the Zibar compound, the beating heart of an empire that stretched from the forests of Central Africa to the markets of Cairo and Constantinople. The walls stood 15 feet high, thick enough to stop a musket ball, smooth enough to prevent any desperate soul from climbing to freedom. Inside those walls, a different world existed, a world of ledgers and chains, of careful accounting and casual brutality, where human beings were transformed into numbers on a page, commodities to be weighed, measured, and sold. The compound covered nearly 3 acres of hard-packed earth. At its center stood the main house, a 2-story structure of imported timber and local stone, where the Zibar patriarch, Ibrahim al-Zibar, conducted his business with the precision of a Cairo banker. To the east, the storehouses held ivory tusks stacked like cordwood, bags of gold dust from the mines of Kordofan, ostrich feathers destined for the drawing rooms of European aristocracy. To the west, separated by a wall within the wall, lay the holding pens. The holding pens could accommodate 300 souls at a time. They were designed with the same attention to efficiency that characterized every aspect of the Zibar operation. Low roofs to prevent standing, packed dirt floors that could be easily cleaned, narrow drainage channels to carry away the waste of human bodies pressed together in the suffocating heat. The smell was something that attached itself to your skin, your clothes, your memory. It was the smell of fear made physical, of bodies breaking down under stress, of death waiting patiently in every corner. Kofi knew this smell. He had lived within it for 17 months. He had breathed it until it became invisible to him, until his lungs no longer registered the difference between the air inside the pens and the air of the outside world. This was not an accident. This was how the system worked. It erased you slowly, piece by piece, until the person you had been became a distant memory, until the only identity that remained was the one the merchants assigned to you. Property, cargo, merchandise. But something in Kofi refused to be erased. Something in the deepest part of his consciousness continued to observe, to remember, to record. While other captives retreated into the protective numbness of despair, Kofi watched. He listened. He learned. and what he learned would eventually bring the entire Zibar network crashing down. If you want to follow more cases like this one, cases that shake the foundations of what we think we know about history, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss a single investigation. The world of the Zibar compound operated according to rules that had been refined over generations. The Zibar family had been in the trade for nearly 200 years, their fortune built by Kofi's great-great-grandfather's generation. When the first Ibrahim al-Zibar recognized that the chaos of the Saharan trade routes could be organized, systematized, made profitable beyond imagination. The current Ibrahim was the fourth of his name, and he had inherited not only wealth, but expertise. The compound functioned like a factory. Captives arrived from the south in coffles, long chains of human beings linked together at the neck, force-marched across hundreds of miles of savanna and scrubland. They arrived broken, dehydrated, half-dead from exhaustion and violence. The Zibar operation received them, assessed them, sorted them into categories. The strong ones, the healthy ones, those who could survive the desert crossing, were separated from the weak. The weak had a different fate. Nothing was wasted in the Zibar compound. This was the secret of their success, the foundation of their wealth. Every captive represented an investment, and Ibrahim al-Zibar was not a man who tolerated losses. Those too sick or too damaged to make the northern journey were sold locally, to smaller traders, to farms along the Nile, to households in El Fasher and El Obeid. Those with skills were identified and put to work within the compound itself. This was how Kofi survived. Before his capture, Kofi had been a healer in his village, a community 3 weeks' march south of the Darfur borderlands. He had learned the properties of plants from his grandmother, had apprenticed with the village elder who understood how to set broken bones, how to draw infection from wounds, how to ease the passage of women in difficult childbirths. When the slave raiders came, when his village burned and his family scattered or died, this knowledge came with him, carried invisibly inside his mind. The Zibar compound had a problem. The holding pens bred disease. Captives arrived already weakened, already carrying infections from their long march north. Packed together in the heat, denied adequate food and water, they sickened and died at rates that cut into profits. Ibrahim al-Zibar had tried various solutions over the years. He had brought in Islamic physicians from Egypt, who proved useless against the particular afflictions of sub-Saharan captives. He had tried local healers, who had some success, but demanded payments he considered excessive. When one of his overseers noticed that Kofi was treating fellow captives with plant preparations he gathered from the edges of the compound, when those treatments actually worked, the overseer reported to Ibrahim, and Ibrahim made a decision that would eventually destroy his family. He removed Kofi from the holding pens. He gave him a small structure near the storehouse, a room where he could prepare his medicines, access to the compound's water supply, limited freedom to move about collecting the plants he needed. He assigned 2 guards to watch Kofi at all times, but these guards grew lazy over the months, accustomed to a prisoner who never tried to escape, who seemed grateful for his elevated position. Kofi was grateful, but not for the reasons they imagined. His new position gave him access to every part of the compound. He treated the overseers when they fell ill. He treated Ibrahim's household servants when they suffered injuries. He treated Ibrahim's own children when they developed the fevers that periodically swept through even the most protected households. And everywhere he went, everything he saw, every conversation he overheard, he remembered. He remembered the routes. He remembered the numbers. He remembered the names of buyers and sellers, the prices paid, the arrangements made. He remembered which European merchants sent agents to the compound, which Egyptian officials received bribes to look the other way, which religious authorities blessed the trade in exchange for donations to their schools and mosques. He built, inside his mind, a complete map of the Zibar network, more detailed than any document in Ibrahim's locked offices. The other captives watched Kofi with mixed emotions. Some saw him as a traitor, a collaborator who had purchased his own comfort by serving the oppressors. Others understood that survival took different forms, that Kofi had found a way to keep breathing in a world designed to stop your breath. A few, the wisest among them, noticed the way Kofi's eyes moved, the careful attention he paid to everything around him, and they began to wonder if something else was happening, something hidden beneath the surface of his apparent submission. Leave a comment saying, "Never give up on truth if you believe that justice must reach all the oppressed." The Zibar compound was not ruled by Ibrahim alone. The trade required too many operations, too much coordination, for any single man to control. Ibrahim was the patriarch, the final authority, but beneath him worked a network of family members, trusted agents, and hired specialists, each responsible for a different aspect of the operation. There was Hassan al-Zibar, Ibrahim's younger brother, who managed the southern routes. Hassan was known for his efficiency, which meant he was known for his brutality. He led the raiding parties that swept through the villages of the Fur and the Zaghawa, the Dinka and the Nuer. He calculated precisely how much violence was necessary to break resistance, how much food and water could be withheld during the march north without killing too many captives before they reached the compound. He kept detailed records, and his return rates, the percentage of captured individuals who arrived alive at the Darfur holding pens, were legendary among the traders. There was Abdul Qadir, Ibrahim's eldest son, who handled the negotiations with foreign buyers. Abdul Qadir dressed like a European when it suited him, spoke French and Italian, and a passable English learned from missionaries he had met in Cairo. He understood the hypocrisy of the Western world, how nations that officially condemned slavery continued to benefit from its products, how officials who publicly supported abolition privately facilitated the continued flow of human cargo. He knew which gifts to send to which officials, which merchants could be trusted to keep secrets, which routes avoided the increasingly troublesome British patrols. There was Sayyida, Ibrahim's sister, who managed the household and oversaw the female captives. Sayyida was perhaps the most complex figure in the compound. She had been born into the trade, had grown up surrounded by its daily realities, and had developed a philosophy that allowed her to participate without apparent guilt. She was kind to the women in her care, relatively speaking. She ensured they were fed adequately, that they were not subjected to casual violence by the male overseers. But she also prepared them for sale, teaching them the skills and behaviors that would make them valuable, transforming them from free women into desirable commodities. She saw no contradiction in this. She believed she was helping them survive. Below the family members were the overseers, Sudanese, Egyptian, and occasionally European men who had found in the slave trade a path to wealth and status that their births would never have provided. They carried whips and clubs, but their primary weapons were psychological. They understood that complete control of the body required first the breaking of the spirit. They applied techniques passed down through generations of slavers, methods designed to produce obedience, to crush rebellion before it could form, to transform human beings into compliant property. And there were the guards, the laborers, the cooks and cleaners and animal handlers who kept the compound functioning. These were the people Kofi interacted with most frequently, and from them he learned the small details that would later prove crucial. He learned which guards gambled and owed money, which were secretly sympathetic to the captives they watched, which could be bribed and which would report any approach. He learned the compound's rhythms, its schedules, its vulnerabilities. But Kofi also learned something else, something that transformed his understanding of the entire operation. He learned about the tunnels. The Zibar compound had been built on the site of an older trading post, one that dated back to the ancient routes that had crossed this territory for 1,000 years. Beneath the current structures, a network of underground passages connected the main buildings, provided secret storage for the most valuable goods, and offered escape routes in case of attack. These tunnels were Ibrahim's most closely guarded secret. Only family members knew of their existence, and only Ibrahim himself knew the complete layout. Kofi discovered them by accident. Treating one of the guards for a festering wound, he had followed the man to a storage room to retrieve additional bandages. The guard, feverish and confused, had touched a section of the wall, and a door had opened onto darkness. The guard had immediately closed it, had sworn Kofi to secrecy, had offered him money to forget what he had seen. Kofi had accepted the money and pretended to forget, but he did not forget. Over the following months, he explored the tunnels whenever opportunity allowed, mapping them in his memory, understanding their connections, identifying where they led. One tunnel, he discovered, extended beyond the compound walls, emerging in a dry riverbed half a mile to the north. Another connected directly to the treasury, where Ibrahim kept his gold, his documents, his records of every transaction stretching back decades. Kofi did not yet know what he would do with this knowledge, but he knew it had value. He knew that the day might come when it would make the difference between death and survival. The morning when everything changed began like any other morning in the compound. The call to prayer echoed from the small mosque Ibrahim had built in the corner of the enclosure. The overseers unlocked the holding pens, counted the captives who had survived the night, removed the bodies of those who had not. The cooks lit fires beneath the massive pots where a thin gruel of millet and water would feed 300 souls. The guards changed their shifts, the new arrivals walking the walls while the night watch retreated to sleep through the worst of the afternoon heat. Kofi was grinding herbs in his workroom when he heard the commotion at the southern gate. A coffle was arriving, but this was not an ordinary coffle. Kofi could tell from the voices of the guards, from the urgency in their movements, that something was different. He set down his grinding stone and moved to the doorway, watching as the gates swung open and the line of captives shuffled into the compound. There were perhaps 40 of them, men and women and children, linked together by the heavy iron collars that the Zibar traders preferred. They were in bad condition, worse than usual, their bodies showing signs of brutal treatment, their eyes carrying the vacant stare of people who had witnessed horrors beyond processing. But it was not their condition that had caused the commotion among the guards. It was the man leading them. Hassan al-Zibar himself had brought this coffle north, abandoning his usual practice of remaining with the raiding parties while subordinates handled the transport. Hassan was riding a fine Arabian horse, his robes dusty from travel, his face set in an expression that mixed triumph with something darker, something Kofi recognized from his years of observation. Fear. Hassan was afraid of something. Kofi watched as Hassan dismounted, as Ibrahim emerged from the main house to greet his brother, as the two men embraced and then immediately separated into tense conversation. He could not hear their words from this distance, but he could read their bodies, the way Hassan's hands moved in emphatic gestures, the way Ibrahim's shoulders stiffened, the way both men kept glancing toward the coffle as if the captives themselves were dangerous. Over the following hours, Kofi learned what had happened. The information came in fragments, pieces of overheard conversation, observations of the unusual activity throughout the compound. Hassan had raided a village in the far south, a village that was supposed to be undefended, easy prey. But the raid had gone wrong. The villagers had resisted with unexpected ferocity. Many of Hassan's men had been killed, and in the chaos of the fighting, something had been discovered. The village, it turned out, had been visited recently by Europeans. Not traders or missionaries, but a different kind of European, one that the Zibar family had learned to fear. Investigators, men sent by the British Anti-Slavery Society, mapping the routes of the trans-Saharan trade, documenting its scale, identifying its key figures. The investigators had left behind papers, maps, letters that revealed how much the outside world was beginning to understand about operations like the Zibar network. Ibrahim ordered these papers brought to his office. He spent the night reading them, and when he emerged the next morning, his face was gray with worry. The British were closer than he had imagined. They had names, they had routes, they had evidence. The system of bribes and silence that had protected the Zibar family for generations was beginning to crack. This was the moment when Kofi understood what he had to do. Among the captives from the destroyed village was a woman named Amara. She was perhaps 30 years old, tall and strong, her face carrying the geometric scarification patterns of her people. She had been the village healer, and it was this fact that brought her to Kofi's attention. Ibrahim, worried about the unusual sickness that was spreading through the new arrivals, ordered Kofi to examine them and treat what he could. When Kofi encountered Amara, when he recognized in her the same knowledge he himself possessed, something passed between them. They spoke in the language of healing, of plants and preparations, of symptoms and treatments. But beneath this surface conversation, another communication was happening. Amara had seen the European investigators. She had spoken with them. She knew things, and she understood that Kofi's position within the compound made him capable of actions that ordinary captives could never attempt. Over the following weeks, Kofi and Amara developed a relationship that existed entirely in glances, in brief exchanges during his medical visits to the holding pens, in messages passed through trusted intermediaries. Amara became his connection to the other captives, his eyes and ears in the parts of the compound he could not access. She organized a network of observers, people who watched and listened and remembered, who compiled the information that Kofi would eventually carry out of this place. But their planning was interrupted by tragedy. Kofi had a brother. Kwame had been captured in the same raid that had taken Kofi 17 months earlier, but the brothers had been separated almost immediately, sent to different parts of the Zibar network. Kofi had assumed Kwame was dead, or lost somewhere in the vast distances of the trade routes, beyond any hope of reunion. He had mourned his brother in silence, adding this grief to the collection of losses he carried within him. When Hassan's coffle entered the compound that morning, Kofi had not recognized any of the captives. They were strangers, people from a different region, speaking different languages, carrying different histories. But 3 weeks later, when another coffle arrived from the eastern routes, Kofi's world collapsed. Kwame was among them, or what remained of Kwame. The young man Kofi remembered, the laughing boy who had chased goats through their village, who had dreamed of becoming a trader himself and traveling to the great cities of the north, had been transformed into something barely human. His body was a map of violence, marked by whips and brands and wounds that had healed badly, leaving ridges of scar tissue that told stories of systematic brutality. His eyes, when they met Kofi's, held recognition but no hope. He had been broken in ways that Kofi's medicines could not heal. Ibrahim's overseers considered Kwame worthless. He could not work, could barely walk, would never survive the desert crossing. He was designated for local sale, a category that in practice meant disposal. The local markets had little use for damaged goods. Captives in Kwame's condition were sold for almost nothing, often to buyers who worked them to death within weeks, or simply killed them and took whatever value could be extracted from their bodies. Kofi begged. For the first and only time during his captivity, he prostrated himself before Ibrahim, pleading for his brother's life. He offered his services permanently, offered to forego any possibility of his own freedom, offered everything he had if Ibrahim would spare Kwame. Ibrahim listened with the patient expression of a man calculating costs and benefits. The answer was no. Ibrahim explained his reasoning with the detached logic that characterized all his decisions. Kwame represented a loss, and losses had to be cut. Keeping him would require food and water that could be allocated more profitably elsewhere. His condition might worsen, spreading disease to more valuable captives. And there was the matter of precedent. If Ibrahim showed mercy to Kofi's brother, other captives with family connections might expect similar treatment. The system could not function if exceptions were made. 3 days later, Kwame was sold to a local farmer known for working his laborers to death within a season. Kofi was not permitted to say goodbye. He watched from his workroom doorway as his brother was led out of the compound, chains clinking, shoulders hunched, moving with the shuffling gait of a man who had already surrendered to death. That night, Kofi made his decision. Everything he had observed, everything he had learned, everything he had compiled in his memory over 17 months of careful watching would be used. He would escape from this place. He would find the Europeans who were investigating the trade. He would tell them everything, and the Zibar family would burn. If you're watching this and you believe that no atrocity should remain hidden, if you believe that the truth has power even centuries after the events occurred, take a moment right now to like this video. That simple action helps more people discover these stories that were almost lost to history. The planning took 3 more months. Kofi could not rush, could not allow the urgency of his grief to compromise the precision his escape required. He continued his work as the compound healer, treating the sick and injured, maintaining the appearance of the compliant prisoner he had always been, but in every spare moment he was preparing. The first challenge was route. The compound lay deep in Darfur, hundreds of miles from any territory controlled by European powers. To the north lay the Sahara, the most dangerous crossing in the world, where countless captives died every year from heat, thirst, and exhaustion. To the east, the Nile Valley, patrolled by Egyptian authorities who cooperated with the traders. To the south, the regions from which the captives came, offering no refuge, To the west, more desert, more slave routes, more hostile territory. Kofi studied maps whenever he could access them. Ibrahim kept charts of the trade routes in his office, detailed representations of paths through the desert, locations of wells and oases, schedules of caravan movements. During his visits to treat household members, Kofi glimpsed these documents, memorizing what he saw, building an internal picture of the geography he would have to navigate. The decision, when it came, was counterintuitive. He would go north, into the desert itself. This was the direction no escaping captive ever chose, the direction that seemed to promise only death. But Kofi had learned things in his 17 months of observation. He knew about the small caravans, the unofficial routes used by independent traders who wanted to avoid the Zibar network's fees and oversight. He knew about the abandoned wells, places not marked on the main maps, but remembered by the oldest guards who had crossed the desert decades ago. And he knew about the European presence in Egypt, the British consuls and French agents and international observers who had gathered in Cairo and Alexandria, watching the flow of human cargo from the south. If he could reach Egypt, he could reach the Europeans, and if he could reach the Europeans, he could tell his story. The second challenge was companions. Kofi could not make the crossing alone. The desert required multiple people, for carrying water, for watching through the night, for helping each other through the inevitable crises. He needed to assemble a group, but every person he recruited increased the risk of betrayal. He chose carefully. Amara was the first, her intelligence and connections essential to the plan. Through Amara, he identified 3 others. Yusuf, a young man from the Fur Highlands who had worked with horses and understood the animals the escape would require. Mariama, a woman from the coastal regions whose husband had been a trader before his capture, giving her knowledge of routes and negotiations. And Zaki, an elderly man who had crossed the desert twice as a free trader before his misfortunes led him into captivity, his memory of the landscape invaluable despite his weakened condition. These 5 met in secret, communicating through systems of signals and coded messages that Kofi developed. They could never gather in one place, could never be seen speaking for more than the briefest exchanges. Discovery would mean death, not just for themselves but for dozens of others who would be suspected of involvement. The third challenge was supplies. The desert crossing required water, food, animals, and protection from the elements. These resources existed within the compound, but were carefully controlled. Every water skin, every bag of dates, every piece of cloth was inventoried and tracked. Stealing what they needed without detection seemed impossible. This was where the tunnels became essential. Kofi had spent months mapping the underground passages, identifying which connected to which storage areas, learning the patterns of access and oversight. The treasury tunnel was the key. It led to a chamber where Ibrahim kept not only gold and documents, but emergency supplies for the family's potential escape, provisions that were checked only occasionally, maintained against the possibility of attack or uprising. Over a period of weeks, Kofi and his companions began moving supplies from this emergency store to a hiding place in the dry riverbed beyond the compound walls. The work was agonizingly slow. Each trip through the tunnels risked discovery. Each item taken increased the chance that the theft would be noticed. But the emergency supplies were meant to sustain Ibrahim's entire family for an extended journey. The amounts Kofi's group required were small by comparison, and Ibrahim's overseers were not expecting theft from within this secure space. By the end of the 3rd month, everything was in place. Water skins sufficient for 5 people for 15 days, dried dates, millet cakes, strips of preserved meat. 2 horses and a camel, purchased through Yusuf's connections with the compound's animal handlers, animals that were supposedly sold to a trader passing through, but were actually hidden in a cave 3 miles from the compound. Cloth for protection against the sun, simple weapons, a small amount of gold taken from the treasury that would purchase assistance along the way. The date Kofi chose was significant. Each year, Ibrahim hosted a gathering of traders and officials from across the region, a celebration of the year's profits, a renewal of alliances and agreements. This gathering required the attention of every overseer, every guard, every family member. For one night, the compound's surveillance would be focused inward, on the festivities, rather than outward, on the captives and the walls. The date fell on a new moon, the darkest night of the month. Everything was ready. The evening of the gathering arrived with the particular golden light that characterized Darfur at that season, the sun descending through layers of dust and heat until it seemed to melt into the western horizon. From his workroom, Kofi watched the preparations unfold, the decorations being hung, the food being prepared, the musicians tuning their instruments in the courtyard of the main house. The captives in the holding pens were fed early and locked down for the night. The guards who usually watched the walls were reassigned to serve at the celebration, their duties covered by a skeleton crew of the oldest and least alert men in the compound's employ. Ibrahim appeared in his finest robes, greeting arriving guests with the warmth and generosity that had made him a respected figure throughout the region. No one was watching Kofi. As darkness fell, he moved. First to the small structure where he had worked for 17 months, gathering the few medicines and tools that might prove useful on the journey. Then to the hidden entrance of the tunnel system, the door he had learned to open silently, the passage that led beneath the walls of the compound and out into the surrounding desert. He met the others at the designated point in the dry riverbed, Amara emerging from the shadows, Yusuf leading the horses and camel, Mariama and Zaki helping each other over the rough terrain. For a moment, they stood together in silence, 5 people who were about to attempt the impossible, who had bet their lives on a journey that would kill most who tried it. Then they moved. The first night's travel took them 15 miles north, following the dry riverbed until it curved east, then striking out across open ground toward the first of the unmarked wells Kofi had learned about from the old guard's stories. They moved in silence, speaking only when necessary, conserving their energy for the challenges ahead. Behind them, the lights of the Zibar compound faded until they were just aglow on the southern horizon, and then even that disappeared. By dawn, they had reached the first well. Zaki, despite his age and weakness, proved invaluable here, recognizing landmarks that confirmed they were on the right path, locating the well's opening beneath a covering of sand and stone that had been placed to hide it from those who did not know to look. The water was brackish but drinkable. They refilled their skins, rested through the hottest hours of the day in the shade of a rocky outcrop, and prepared for the second night's journey. This would be the pattern for the next 2 weeks: travel by night, when the desert cold was manageable and the stars provided navigation; rest by day, seeking whatever shade could be found, rationing water and food with desperate precision. Mile by mile they moved north, deeper into the Sahara, farther from the Zibar compound, closer to the Egyptian border and the European presence that represented their only hope. On the 5th night, they encountered their first crisis. A sandstorm rose from the west without warning, the wind building from a whisper to a howl within minutes, the air filling with particles that cut exposed skin and choked unprotected lungs. They had no shelter, no way to escape the fury of the elements. The horses panicked, and one broke free from Yusuf's grip, disappearing into the swirling darkness. The camel knelt and refused to move, its instincts telling it to wait out the storm. The 5 humans huddled around the animal, using its bulk as a windbreak, covering their faces with cloth, praying to whatever powers they believed in for survival. The storm lasted 7 hours. When it finally subsided, as the sun rose on a landscape transformed by newly deposited dunes, they assessed their losses. 1 horse gone, never to be found. 1/3 of their water supply lost when the skins carried by the missing horse were ripped away in the wind. Mariama injured, her ankle twisted when she had been knocked down by a gust, now unable to walk without support. Zaki, the elderly man whose knowledge of the desert had guided them this far, looked at the others with an expression that mixed sorrow with determination. He knew, as they all knew, what had to happen next. "I will slow you down," he said simply. "Leave me. Continue north. The second well is 2 nights from here, bearing slightly west. You can make it if you move quickly." Kofi refused. They all refused. They would not abandon one of their own, would not become the kind of people who sacrificed others for their survival. But Zaki was insistent. He had known when he agreed to join the escape that his age and condition made him the weakest member of the group. He had prepared himself for this moment. "My life is almost over regardless," he said. "Yours are just beginning. And what you carry, what you know, it must reach the Europeans. It must. The Zibar family has destroyed too many lives. This is my chance to strike back at them, even in death. Do not take this from me. In the end, they compromised. They would continue together for one more night, Mariama riding the remaining horse while Zaki walked with support. If Zaki could not continue after that, if his body failed him, they would discuss options again. Zaki made it through that night, and the next, and the one after that. His will proved stronger than his flesh, his hatred for the Zibar family a fuel that kept him moving when his muscles screamed for rest. But on the 8th night, as they approached the region where the Egyptian border lay somewhere in the unmarked sand, his heart stopped. They buried him in a shallow grave, the best they could manage in the hard-packed earth. Kofi spoke words in his own language, prayers he remembered from his grandmother, invocations of ancestors and spirits that seemed very far away in this empty landscape. Then they continued north, carrying Zaki's water ration, carrying his memory, carrying the weight of his sacrifice. 4 remained. The Egyptian border was not a line on the ground. It was an idea, a political concept that meant nothing to the sand and rock of the desert. But it meant something to the patrols that occasionally swept through this region, Egyptian soldiers and officials who enforced the Khedive's authority, who collected taxes from traders and sometimes asked questions about the human cargo that moved through their territory. Kofi had planned for this encounter. The small amount of gold he carried, stolen from Ibrahim's treasury, was intended to purchase passage, to bribe any official who might otherwise detain them. But when the patrol finally appeared, on the 10th morning of their journey, the soldiers showed no interest in gold. They were looking specifically for escaped slaves. Word had spread from the Zibar compound. Ibrahim, discovering the escape the morning after the gathering, had sent riders in every direction, offering substantial rewards for the capture and return of the 5 fugitives. The description circulated throughout the trade networks reached the Egyptian officials, who found in the hunt an opportunity to curry favor with powerful Sudanese merchants. The patrol consisted of 12 soldiers, well-armed, mounted on horses that were fresher and faster than the exhausted animals Kofi's group possessed. There was no possibility of outrunning them, no way to hide in the featureless landscape. The 4 fugitives had seconds to make a decision. Amara made it for them. She spurred her horse forward, not toward the Egyptian patrol but away, angling east at a full gallop. She shouted as she rode, drawing attention, making herself the obvious target. The patrol commander, faced with a choice between pursuing one fleeing figure and capturing the 3 others who remained, split his force. 8 soldiers went after Amara. 4 stayed to deal with Kofi, Yusuf, and Mariama. Kofi never saw Amara again. He would learn much later that she was captured after a chase of several miles, that she was returned to the Zibar compound, that her fate there was worse than death, but her sacrifice bought the precious minutes that the others needed. In the confusion of the pursuit, as the 4 remaining soldiers focused on Amara's dramatic flight, Kofi made a decision. He dismounted from the camel, told Yusuf and Mariama to continue north, and turned to face the soldiers alone. "I am the one you want," he said in the Arabic he had learned during his captivity. "I am the healer from the Zibar compound. The others are nothing. I am the one with value." The soldiers hesitated. Their orders were to capture the fugitives, but a captive who surrendered willingly, who claimed special importance, might represent a different kind of opportunity. The commander, riding back after sending his men after Amara, assessed the situation. A healer, he understood, was valuable. Perhaps more valuable returned alive and cooperative than dragged back in chains. Kofi was gambling on this calculation. He was gambling on his perceived value, on the assumption that he would be taken to Cairo for questioning rather than returned immediately to Darfur. He was gambling that in Cairo he would have access to the Europeans he sought. The gamble worked, partially. The commander decided to take Kofi to Egyptian authorities rather than return him to the Zibar traders. But Yusuf and Mariama, rather than fleeing as Kofi had instructed, had stayed. They were captured too, chained alongside Kofi, destined for the same uncertain fate. 3 remained. If you've made it this far in the story, you understand that this is more than entertainment. This is history, real history, the kind that powerful people tried to erase. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end, so I know who really cares about these forgotten stories." Cairo in 1845 was a city of contradictions. The ancient capital of the pharaohs had become a hub of international commerce, a meeting point for European powers jockeying for influence in the declining Ottoman Empire. British consuls worked to suppress the slave trade, while British merchants quietly profited from its products. French agents cultivated relationships with Egyptian officials, while French academics studied the antiquities that lay beneath the modern city. Everywhere, the old world and the new world collided, creating opportunities for those who knew how to navigate the chaos. Kofi arrived in Cairo as a prisoner, but a prisoner of unusual status. The Egyptian commander who had captured him recognized that the healer might have intelligence value, information about the Sudanese trade routes that could be useful to various parties. Rather than selling him immediately, the commander brought him to the attention of a mid-level official in the Khedive's government, a man named Ahmad Rashid, who had made his career by providing valuable information to those who could pay for it. Ahmad Rashid was a pragmatist. He understood that the international pressure against the slave trade was growing, that the British in particular were becoming increasingly aggressive in their efforts to suppress it. He also understood that information about the trade was valuable to many parties, to the British who wanted to destroy it, to the traders who wanted to protect it, to the Egyptian government that wanted to play both sides. Kofi, with his 17 months of observation inside the Zibar compound, represented a treasure of intelligence. But Rashid made a miscalculation. He assumed that Kofi was just another slave, traumatized and broken, eager to cooperate with anyone who offered even marginal improvement in his circumstances. He assumed that Kofi's information could be extracted and sold to the highest bidder. He did not understand that Kofi had an agenda of his own. During his initial interrogations, Kofi was careful. He answered questions about the Zibar compound, about the routes and the methods, about the names and the numbers. He established himself as a valuable source, as someone who had observed the operation from a privileged position, as someone whose testimony could damage the Zibar network. But he withheld the most important information, the details that would make his account impossible to ignore. He withheld the names of the Europeans. In his 17 months of observation, Kofi had learned something that the British investigators had suspected but could not prove, that the trans-Saharan slave trade was not merely tolerated by certain European interests, but actively facilitated by them. Merchants based in France, in Italy, in Spain, even in Britain itself, maintained secret connections with the Zibar network, purchasing human beings through intermediaries, profiting from the trade while publicly condemning it. Officials in multiple governments received payments to look the other way, to suppress investigations, to protect the flow of human cargo. This was the secret of the Zibar merchants. This was the information that could bring down not just one family, but an entire international system of complicity. Kofi knew that if he revealed these names to Ahmad Rashid, the information would be sold to those it implicated, and he would be silenced before it could reach anyone who might actually use it. He needed to reach the British directly, to find someone who had both the power to act and the motivation to do so. His opportunity came through an unexpected source: Yusuf. Yusuf had been separated from Kofi after their capture, sold to a household in Cairo as domestic labor. But the young man had not forgotten the mission they had undertaken together, had not abandoned the hope that their testimony might still reach those who needed to hear it. Through the networks of communication that existed among the enslaved population of Cairo, Yusuf made contact with Kofi and delivered a crucial message. The British consul, a man named Charles Murray, was actively seeking information about the Sudanese trade routes. He had heard rumors that a former slave from the Zibar compound was being held by Egyptian officials, and he was attempting to arrange a meeting. Kofi knew this might be his only chance. Through a series of carefully orchestrated maneuvers, a combination of bribery, deception, and the assistance of sympathetic individuals within the Egyptian bureaucracy, Kofi was able to send a message to Consul Murray. The message contained one piece of information: a name, a British name. A man who sat in Parliament, who gave speeches condemning slavery, who was secretly invested in trading companies that purchased captives from the Zibar network. The effect was immediate. Within a week, Charles Murray had arranged for Kofi to be transferred to British custody, officially as a witness in an investigation of the slave trade, unofficially as the most important intelligence asset to emerge from the African interior in years. Yusuf and Mariama, located through Murray's efforts, were brought to the British consulate as well. For the first time since their capture, the three survivors were reunited in something approaching safety. The debriefing that followed lasted for 3 months. Kofi recounted everything he had observed: the structure of the Zibar compound, the routes of the trade, the methods of the slavers, the conditions of the captives. He provided names, dates, numbers, details that confirmed suspicions and revealed new information that investigators had never imagined. He described the tunnels, the secret storage chambers, the financial records that Ibrahim kept hidden from everyone except family members, and he revealed the European connections. The list was explosive. It included merchants, officials, even members of the aristocracy. It detailed the mechanisms of their involvement: the shell companies, the intermediaries, the coded communications, the payments that flowed through banks in multiple countries. It provided evidence that the trans-Saharan slave trade, far from being a relic of the past or a purely African phenomenon, was an integrated part of the global economy, protected by some of the most powerful figures in European society. Charles Murray understood the significance of what he had received. He also understood the danger. If he pursued this information through official channels, if he attempted to expose the individuals named in Kofi's testimony, he would face resistance from the highest levels. The people implicated had the power to destroy his career, to suppress the evidence, to make Kofi and his companions disappear. Instead, Murray chose a different path. He cultivated relationships with journalists and reformers, with members of the Anti-Slavery Society, who were willing to act outside official channels, with political figures who had staked their reputations on the abolition cause and could not afford to be seen protecting those who profited from human bondage. Slowly, carefully, he began to release the information, piece by piece, ensuring that each revelation built on the last, that the pressure on the implicated parties continued to grow. The Zibar family, learning that Kofi had reached the British, attempted to silence him. Assassins were dispatched to Cairo, men who specialized in eliminating problems for wealthy clients. But Murray had anticipated this, had placed Kofi and his companions under protection, had spread word that their full testimony was documented and would be released if anything happened to them. The assassins were captured before they could act. Their interrogation revealed even more about the Zibar network, about its reach and its methods, about the desperation that now gripped the family as their secrets began to emerge. By early 1846, the situation had become untenable. The revelations from Cairo had sparked investigations in Britain, France, and Italy. Several merchants had been arrested, their records seized, their connections exposed. The member of parliament named in Kofi's initial message had resigned in disgrace, his involvement in the trade confirmed by documents that could no longer be suppressed. And in Darfur, the Zibar compound was burning. The news reached Cairo in fragments, carried by traders and travelers who had witnessed the aftermath. An uprising among the captives, led by those who had heard whispers of Kofi's escape and testimony, had overwhelmed the guards during a moment of vulnerability. The holding pens had been opened, the walls breached, the main house set ablaze. Ibrahim al-Zibar had died in the flames, along with most of his family. The survivors had scattered, their network shattered, their wealth destroyed. But the impact extended far beyond one compound in Darfur. The methods Kofi had revealed, the connections he had exposed, the evidence he had provided, created a template for investigations throughout the region. Other trading networks, other families who had operated in the shadows for generations, found themselves suddenly visible, suddenly vulnerable. The pressure from European powers, armed with specific intelligence rather than vague suspicions, forced Egyptian and Sudanese authorities to act where they had previously looked the other way. The trans-Saharan slave trade did not end in 1846. It continued for decades, adapting to new pressures, finding new routes and methods. But its scale diminished, its profitability declined, its defenders became fewer and more isolated. The world that had allowed it to flourish, the world of complicity and silence, began to change. And this change began with one man's decision to remember, to observe, to escape, and to speak. Kofi never returned to his homeland. The village of his birth had been destroyed in the raid that took him, its location unmarked, its people scattered or dead. He remained in Egypt for several years, working with British investigators, providing testimony for trials, advising on efforts to intercept remaining trade routes. He married Mariama in a ceremony that combined traditions from both their peoples, creating a new family to replace those they had lost. Yusuf returned to Africa, traveling south on a British ship, seeking his own people in the regions where the Fur and Zagawa lived. He carried with him letters from Kofi, messages to be spread throughout the communities of the interior, word that resistance was possible, that the great trading families were not invincible, that the world beyond the desert was beginning to listen. The graves of Zaki and Amara were never found. They lie somewhere in the Sahara, unmarked, unknown, their bones long since scattered by the wind and the sand. But their sacrifice was not forgotten. In the oral traditions that developed among the freed captives, in the songs that were sung in the villages where word of the Zibar uprising spread, Zaki and Amara were remembered as martyrs, as those who gave their lives so that others might live in freedom. Today, in the museums of Cairo and London, documents exist that bear Kofi's testimony. Yellowed papers covered in careful handwriting, transcriptions of his accounts, maps he drew from memory showing the layout of the compound and the routes of the trade. Scholars study these documents, reconstructing the history of a period that many would prefer to forget. They find in Kofi's words a witness, a voice from within the machinery of oppression, speaking truth to powers that had believed themselves beyond accountability. The ruins of the Zibar compound still exist, half buried in the sands of Darfur. Local people avoid them, remembering the stories of what happened there, the screams that once echoed from the holding pens, the flames that consumed the main house on the night of the uprising. But occasionally, visitors come, researchers and journalists and descendants of those who were once held captive there. They walk among the crumbling walls trying to imagine what Kofi witnessed, trying to understand how one man could carry so much weight of memory, could transform that weight into the weapon that brought down an empire of suffering. The wind still carries voices at night, the elders say. Whispers in languages no one speaks anymore. Perhaps they are the voices of the lost, the thousands who passed through this place and never emerged, whose bones lie scattered across the desert routes. Perhaps they are calling for remembrance, asking that their suffering not be forgotten, demanding that the truth continue to be spoken even when those who inflicted the suffering would prefer silence. Kofi heard those voices for the rest of his life. He heard them in his dreams, in the quiet moments between waking and sleeping, in the rustle of wind through the streets of Cairo. He understood that he carried them within him, that their stories had become part of his story, that his survival and his testimony were not just his own achievement, but the culmination of countless individual acts of resistance, countless refusals to be completely broken, countless moments when someone chose to remember instead of to forget. This is the legacy he left behind. Not just the documents, not just the testimony, not just the impact on the historical record, but the example, the proof that even within the most oppressive systems, even in conditions designed to crush the human spirit, the capacity for observation, for memory, for communication remains. The demonstration that one person, armed with nothing but knowledge and determination, can change the course of history. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these stories that marked our world forever. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until the end so I can know you and understand who really cares about the search for historical truth." Like this video if Kofi's story touched your heart. Share it so that his memory and the memory of all those who suffered and resisted will never be forgotten. And subscribe to this channel because there are many more stories like this one, stories that powerful people wanted buried, stories that deserve to be told. Until next time.